Hi, everyone. Today is March 3rd, 2021. Sorry, March 3rd, 2021. And today I have the great honor of interviewing the executive director of one of the world's largest, I think it is the largest actually, the largest Earth Day environmental organization. So this is kind of the umbrella organization that activates all of the little nonprofits that we see globally. It's called earthday.org, and I'm going to be interviewing the executive director, Kathleen Rogers. I want to show you, before I bring her on and interview her, I want to show you a few of the things that we're going to be talking about and some climate good news. So I'm going to share the screen. So the first thing that I want to show you is this. We had a global emissions reduction of 10%, carbon emissions reduction of 10%. It was 10% by road transport, 40% by airline transport. It was different in different parts of the world. So in the US and the European Union and the UK, it was between 11 and 13% reduction. In China, it was only 1.7% reduction. So obviously there's a couple of themes here. One is, how can we keep these reductions in the developed world in a post-pandemic world? And how can we inspire China and India and some of the largest footprints, most people on the planet, largest footprints for carbon emissions, to have more dramatic reduction in their carbon emissions. I also wanted to show you a couple of other things. So here's another chart that I think we should get familiar with. And this is the power sources of the US electric grid. So as you can see, in 2019, and we don't have it updated for 2020 yet, although that should come out soon, the renewables was only 17%, 20% nuclear, and it is 62% fossil fuels. Now, this does vary by state dramatically. As an example, in California, it's much better. So in California, this is from 2020, you can see that the renewables are taking up almost about 45% there in renewables. And we have our coal is less than, it's a rounding error, essentially. Natural gas is a big piece of it, but the fossil fuel of California being about 47% versus, the grid being more like 62%. Also, other states are much higher than even the national average. So if you look at Florida, for example, you can see here that their renewable footprint is very small, and the amount that they're using of fossil fuels is very high. So it's over 80%, of almost 85% fossil fuels in Florida. Colorado is very high as well. So some of these states, they're saying that they're increasing, and they are. Oh, look at Colorado is increasing. Look at that wind footprint. But they still have a big piece of fossil fuels. You can see here it's about 74% fossil fuels. So one of the things that we really want to do is to educate people, and this is certainly something I'm going to be talking to Kathleen Rogers about, how we can green the grid and get our politicians on board to do that. We'll also be talking about, and I do recommend you go to earthday.org. There are 51 tips that everyone can take to green their lives. And hey, let's face it, if each one of us had a greener life, we'd have a greener planet. So here you can learn more about the Earth Day Network. So it was founded on the first Earth Day in 1970. That would be April 22nd. There are over 1 billion individuals mobilized and 75,000 partners in the Earth Day organization. So there are many ways that you can become a partner, including you'll learn how to become a climate citizen, so a citizen scientist, by downloading their Earth Challenge app, which I recommend that you do as well. All right, so I'll be back shortly with Kathleen Rogers, and we'll be digging into all the ways that we can green our own lives, which will go a long way to greening our planet, but also greening the grid, and the other ways that we can protect pollinators, that we can support and restore planet Earth. Thank you. I'll see you in just a moment.
So what are we going to talk?
Sorry. All right, so I have Kathleen Rogers here on audio only. So you're gonna have to look at my face, but I'm gonna also throw up some charts. So I already did a timestamp on this, and I talked a little bit about some of the good news that happened in 2020, which was 10% reduction in road transport, 40% reduction in carbon emissions from air travel, aggregate 10% carbon emissions reduction globally. The US and the European Union much better. China only 1.7% down. So my question to you, and I'm sure this is a part of what you're trying to do with Restore Our Earth, is how can we make these reductions more permanent in the Western world and in the developed world, and also try to get the developing world up to speed a little more?
Yeah, so that is such a great question. And by the way, thank you for having me on the show. I love your questions, and I love being with you. So especially as we march towards Earth Day. I'd like to caution your listeners a little bit about global emissions reduction. In fact, I think while that might be partially true, the math is kind of confusing. And so the reality is we are making very little progress towards achieving the goals that were laid out in the Paris Agreement. And as you know, for the past 4 years, the United States has been missing in action, and we are now back. So I do think with that opportunity for the United States to seek its place at the table once again, yeah. I think you'll see, I'm hoping that the world does not reject our, let's call it, moral leadership on the issue, because we remain the biggest polluter in the world. But the fact that we finance so much, and that our leadership and on business and laws and regulations in the United States actually will put us in good stead with the rest of the world in the coming year. And as you know, on Earth Day, President Biden, at our request, which was terrific, agreed to hold a global summit of climate leaders, primarily the big emitters. And so when you take the big emitters, China, India, United States, Brazil, the EU, if you can look at them collectively, yeah, we all have a really long way to go. And in fact, last year was the year that all the countries that signed the Paris Accord were supposed to up their commitments, which was expected as part of the treaty. And almost nobody did. I think the Gambia, which is a great small country in Africa, were, right. I think it was one of the only countries that upped their commitment. So while there's a little bit of good news in terms of carbon emissions from different industries or sectors, transportation and others, we still have countries like China and India going full hog on coal, building new power plants. And so the numbers on the one hand look great coming from some analysts and finance people, and they look really bad coming from other scientists on the other hand. So I'm normally, as I think I've told you before, a pathological optimist. So I tend to go with the better numbers, but I do have that reality facing us, that both with respect to biodiversity and terrible weather events, et cetera, that the world really needs to up their ambition on climate change. And the US in particular has the authority and the money to both do it ourselves in the United States, as well as help out the developing world. And I'd like to distinguish between countries like China and India from countries in Africa who, through no fault of their own, are feeling the impacts of climate change, but have nothing to do with, even currently, the big emissions footprints that are common to the industrialized world, including India and China.
I think that's an important distinction. And also, when we talk about these numbers, they were absolutely pandemic induced. If we go back to the way we were in 2019 and everybody on the road and flying as much as we were, it's no reduction at all. It's an increase, as you're pointing out. So I think that it's wonderful that you guys are taking the initiative to get individuals sparked and also collectively as well. So let's talk a little bit about how we can restore our Earth from an individual standpoint, because you guys have a list of 51 actions. Like if you were to say top 3 that each one of us should make sure we're doing right now, and then dive into the rest, the other 47, what would you say, or 48? You still with us, Kathleen? I think I might have lost you. Okay, so what I was talking about is let's dive into Restore Our Earth. And there's a list of 51 actions individuals can take on the earthday.org website. If you were to just say 3, listen, everybody I know, if we just started here and then we got to the other 48 or made a commitment to ourselves, what do you think is the most impact that an individual can make?
Well, part of me wants to answer the question with what I know based on 25 years of doing this, which is every individual action that you take, whether it's attempting to recycle, and that's very tough in most markets. And I'm a very avid recycler for sure, to whether you're taking public transportation, almost anything you can do on a personal level, reduce or eliminate meat and dairy, which both from a humane perspective for animals, as well as it's the carbon footprint are major of major significance. But I'd also like to tell your viewers that the thing we can do best, the most important thing we can do is constantly remind our elected officials, everything from our school boards to our board of supervisors, our city councils, our members of Congress, our state legislators, that you care about this and really do it on a regular basis. Because as much as I want to believe in, and I do practice quite a number of environmental and climate friendly behaviors, and I'm terrible on others. I mean, it's really hard for me to get around without my car, where I live near the Potomac, and it would take me for hours to use public transportation. So I am an imperfect environmentalist. But one thing I know is if you constantly remind your elected officials at any level, and if we all do it collectively, it's probably the most important thing you can do. And then behind that, it's taking speaking up to your friends and your community and your churches, synagogues, whatever, letting people know that this is a top issue for you, and speaking out and speaking up about climate and environmental issues is really critical. So the voting, speaking to your public officials, speaking out to your community members, and not as some kind of, I really avoid being a know-it-all on the subject, although frankly, at this point, I know a ton about the subject, more than you'd ever want to know. But I try to listen also because, as you know, Earth Day's target population is what we call everybody else, not the green people, but those people who either don't have the time to listen, don't think they're involved, have a small footprint and therefore don't feel responsible, or have different political views. From my perspective, and it's actually fun, is to invest in listening and talking to people who aren't as engaged as you might be, or committed as you might be, or knowledgeable as you might be. So finding people who are different and making friends with them and finding common ground. And certainly in this political atmosphere, I can't think of anything that's more valuable than finding common ground with other people.
And making friends, I really like that. You know, it's not easy, as you pointed out. There, you know, I was in Arizona recently and they stopped their recycling program. So, I mean, you are right that a lot of this is stuff that really has to be done on a higher level than the individual level. So let's talk about that for just a moment. Like let's say each level, let's say first, just reaching out to administrators and getting more climate literacy in our K through 12 schools. Like, how would you, as an individual or a parent or a concerned citizen, start approaching this and making friends with administrators who might insert it into their curriculum? I mean, teachers are overworked and underpaid,
Right.
but this is essential. So how do we inspire them and make it easy for them?
Well, there are a couple of ways. One is asking the principal of your school for the information of who they'd suggest you write to. So, as you know, we have 50 state systems, and even within states,
Right.
you have counties or jurisdictions that do their own thing. It's incredibly complicated. Whereas other countries, some of them are like us, but most of them are top down, which makes it easy. The books all say the same thing, but nonetheless, the biggest problem we found is there's not a single country on earth, so we don't really have to feel guilty about it, that does either of the two things that I think we're talking about. The first is not a single state, jurisdiction, country has either adequate or any climate and environmental literacy curricula. And studies show that maybe a student will hear an hour or an hour and a half about the environment or climate change specifically during any one of the 4 years of their high school. It's a really dismal situation. And the reason it is, politics aside, so let's pretend that 99% of the world, I think it's probably right, believes in man-made climate change, human-made climate change, that there are, it's really important that students understand that tomorrow's entrepreneurs and successful business people, teachers, scientists have to be educated. And we know this because we talk to university presidents all the time who are saying, hey, we're out there creating cutting edge degrees and investing in R&D at our universities and community colleges. And that's a lot where the action is, at community colleges and local colleges, because they can get 2-year degrees and become wind turbine engineers or green builders or green designers. And so the jobs of tomorrow, and actually the jobs of today, are really dependent on having an educated workforce, a green educated workforce. So you have to kind of go above the teacher or the principal, because their day-to-day lesson plans are prescribed by the county or state or whatever it is. And so most of my community is relegated to do what we call non-formal environmental climate education, which teachers love, don't get me wrong. So that could include a trip to a river to test water quality, to augment what you're learning in biology or chemistry.
Right.
It could include lots of different things. So what we're trying to do is move the conversation up the ladder. So the education supervisor for your county is our ultimate goal. And then eventually to the state authority, the Secretary of Education or Director of Education for the state. And, everyone's willing to do Earth Day education. It's a time of year they reserve for it. Sometimes it's in the curricula. But as you know, we're the 365-day-a-year organization that uses Earth Day as a way to catapult or move people down the pathway. But ultimately, our mission is, diversity of opinion and ideas and people, and getting everybody engaged in the conversation. But sorry. Mostly, I think what's important is that we really focus on the opportunities and the green jobs, and having the ability for the United States to continue to compete in the world, because lots of countries are ahead of us. And I think that's something that's lost on the American public, is that at this point, the failure to educate people on climate and environmental literacy is a national liability.
And such an opportunity when we do. I wanted to just point that out. I've been looking at these statistics, and the top 10 fastest growing jobs other than healthcare. Number one, wind turbine operators, as you said, and number three was solar panel installers. So there are opportunities here right today and the jobs of tomorrow. Absolutely. What I also, just to kind of wrap up what you were saying, so a couple of things. With regard to just this literacy, you were saying we need to engage with the people that are developing the curriculum. And so we need to know who they are, and maybe the principal can help to guide us to that. But the other thing which I love is this idea of non-formal curriculum, which teachers welcome from
Right.
parents. So you can go in with an idea for a field trip or a mini lesson, and that might include math and language arts and things that they can tick off the box on their, standard.
Exactly.
And they welcome that as long as it's something that can be additive for their room. But the other thing too here is the hands-on learning gardens. I'm seeing, parents and teachers and even using outside resources in terms of financing. Like for instance, there's an organization that you might know about called Green Our Planet, and they took county resources to remove grass from the schools. And then they did a little GoFundMe in addition to that to put in learning gardens. They kept a grassy playing field for the kids to play in. And, this is something that saves the school a boatload of money on the water that they would spend watering all that grass, right? So it also puts in more money that can be deployed for other things when it's not all going to energy and water.
Yeah, and I think that's really important. The other thing I would really recommend, and it has to do with really, I think one of the strengths of the American public is that we're a very charitable nation. I can't tell you, because I do international fundraising, how little money is out there for the kinds of things you're talking about. And everybody turns to the US. We're very generous. But one thing your listeners could do, and I really mean it, it's not that hard, is also, if they're going to do something in their own schools or their own communities, if they have the resources, to find a community and partner with them that's not as wealthy, that doesn't have the opportunities, because we have such a tragic division in our country between the facilities that our kids go to school in. I mean, so many of them I've toured are falling apart. No heating and air conditioning when it's cold or really hot. It's just an extraordinarily unequal landscape with bad indoor air quality, cement for a yard, and extremely difficult. So to the extent your listeners can or are able, is to, and it's great for the kids to learn how to communicate with other kids, whether they're urban versus country or suburban, and really make an effort to, whatever you're doing, try to duplicate it or pay it forward, I guess, as people say these days, and try to do something in communities that are not as resource rich. And I'll tell you, and I may have talked to you about this in past years, but my sister has children in high school in California, and I was driving to her house, and I passed by the high school, and it had a thermometer, a giant thermometer, like a story and a half thermometer. And their goal, the PTA, was to raise $1 million. And they were 2/3 of the way up the ladder. And I had just come from a very poor school district. That's why I was out in California staying with my sister for free. And so I was working in Oakland in a school that had nothing. And I mean nothing. And these kids were trying so hard. They were all super smart kids that had been gathered together. And so I think it's really important that we all recognize there's no PTA in these inner city schools that can raise $1 million. So how we, helping them is really critical.
I am so glad you brought that up. And it kind of ties into what I wanted to talk about with regard to the Canopy project. So let's do the big picture on that, because you guys have done extraordinary work. I read a statistic since 2010 that the earthday.org organization has done tens of millions of trees planted. So first off, give us the broad view and the good news on that. How have you achieved that? And then we'll drill it down more to the community level, and also pay, like you said, pay it forward, because the difference between an urban setting with no trees and a boatload of cement could be 10 degrees different, right? Than a place that has some shade and also better oxygen. So let's talk about the big picture first and then the community picture.
Yeah, and I think we talked briefly about this. The theme for Earth Day 2021, which by the way, we decided way before COVID was even something anybody had ever heard of. But it seems so apt right now, which was focused on a number of issues, one of which is reforestation. And as we know, trees and vegetation give us the oxygen that we breathe, and we have taken it upon ourselves to both, clear cut most of the major forests around the world. There's some intact, but very few, and pollute or otherwise contaminate a lot of the groundwater and other surface waters because of runoff and chemicals and other things. And a lot of that would have been aided and abetted by vegetation, including trees. So there is a global movement. Now, we cannot solve climate change by planting trees, but we can actually make it way down the field if we do. So there are huge initiatives worldwide that we're participating in, hoping to plant somewhere upwards of close to 1 trillion trees. And of course, how and where we plant them has to be based on science and community. And so our goal is to work in those areas where we think we can have both a success in tree planting, but also in creating sustainable projects at the ground level and protecting those forests. We've done a number of things in Haiti, for example, post earthquake and whatever else they had there, endless tragedies. We worked with a really great group and planted trees. But unfortunately, within a year, the situation was so desperate in Haiti that the local population, despite the fact this was a protected area, just took out all our trees. So we've learned a lot. That was years and years ago, but we've made a real science on how and where we plant trees in order to get the biggest bang we can out of our money from a climate perspective. But we have other projects in India, for example, where we're planting fruit trees, and that's a really great one. I actually went over and worked with them for a few days and watched what they were doing. But the way it works is you have communities, common land turned into fruit orchards, which is really important for water quality. They have terrible problems with runoff and pesticides and pollutants, and you can't get them to just throw up a forest on the land, so they want to make it work for them. So we do these fruit plantations all over the place now, and half the fruit goes to market, half the fruit stays in the community, and they are protecting their own trees as if they're their children because it means something to them economically. So the other thing we try and do is plant in a circle around existing protected areas that have been denuded for one reason or another, and be really aware of the community that we're planting in to make sure that they're with us, so to speak, and will protect what we've planted. So those two things. And then, of course, there are lots of other reasons and other places that we choose based on biodiversity or water quality. We have a project in Mexico that's heavily focused on riparian along the edges of rivers there for the same reason: pesticides, chemicals, runoff that clogs the river, kills the fish. So we do a lot of low-level tree planting in a biosphere reserve, which is already protected. So we have all levels of tree planting projects, as do other groups. There are also really interesting projects going on where people are shooting seedlings into the ground from an airplane or catapults. So there are amazing technological trials going on in terms of rapid reforestation. They have to play out. We'll see how that goes. We're not involved in those, but they're good faith efforts to bring back some of our forests. And as you know, not just for the oxygen and the water quality, but for biodiversity and for our health generally.
Yeah, and the health of our soil and all of the things that.
Exactly. And also to create a buffer. I mean, the jury's in. I'm sorry. This was a bat that caused COVID in these terrible wet markets and interactions between humans and the animals that are in their communities. And we have to recognize that this is happening over and over again. This was just the first of many that scientists tragically predict could happen in the future, but we have to create buffer zones for these animals. We have to stop taking them out of the forest. We have to leave them alone, and we have to create a buffer between them and us in order to protect our health. So it's not just the health of the community, the health of the rivers, the health of the planet from an oxygen and point of view, biodiversity, but really to protect ourselves. And that's critical. And forests have that really important capacity to do that for us by creating dense forests in areas where we have reason to believe that interaction with the species would be a problem.
Can we talk a little bit about the pesticides and that sort of thing? Because you're talking also about making choices that will protect pollinators by eliminating pesticides from your own as a consumer even. So how can we do a better job of this?
Yeah, so organic, the prices have come down a lot. But we also need to be aware that we can't live without pollinators, right? But giant percentage of our food is the result of pollination. And so whether you're talking about a bee or a butterfly or any other species that's involved in pollinating, we have to be really aware of the benefits. And it's not something that comes to mind when we're eating honey or enjoying a piece of fruit or anything else. But it is a combination of agribusiness where they use bee colonies and they move them around. So they actually pick up the queen and load them all up and put them on a truck, I'm not kidding, and move them all over the state of California and other states to pollinate it. Let's say almond trees. Well, pollinators are not single food species. They like variety just like we do. And so that's a sort of one of the reasons we think that we're seeing so many declines in honeybees and other pollinators is because we treat them as if they're a commodity and not part of the ecosystem that supports them. And then on the chemical side, lots of countries are banning various chemicals that they know weakens the population. And by that, it may not actually kill them outright, although some of these chemicals do. And the EU has banned a lot of them. We haven't gotten a grip on this at all in the United States. Again, agribusiness, paying their way to make sure that their interests are not diminished in any way. And so we have to be really active and committed to understanding where our food comes from, speaking up about these pesticides and chemicals when they come up in your community. I was at a big giant grocery store the other day, and there was a big sign that said it was selling a chemical, and it said, this chemical is banned in my county. But people were buying it. I have no idea if they lived in my county, but everyone was just buying it anyway because it was for sale. And so it's a little bit harder to educate yourself, but in the end of the day, the store should not have been selling it because they had no idea where it was going, even though they knew it was banned in Montgomery County where I live. So we have to be aware that I think that the interests that bring us our food, and most of us are lazy, including me. But we have to take that extra step to understand that without bees, without pollinators, we're not going to survive, literally will not survive. And so these chemicals need to be banned. There are a handful of them. I can send you a list of them for your listeners. And that legislation can come up in a local context, or it can come up in a state or nationally. And so if they hear about it, they should try and jump on board and be supportive of stores and businesses that don't sell these chemicals.
So, okay, so we've got another thing that we could be writing to our politicians about, but also just choosing organic and maybe making sure that you're not spraying these chemicals in your own garden and or in your school gardens. This will help as well.
Absolutely. I mean, the truth is we should not be using any chemicals on our lawns. And half the time we shouldn't even be using these heavy duty fertilizers either, because eventually they find their way into our water. Yeah. And I love looking out at big green spaces, don't get me wrong. But we have our love affair with fertilizers and chemicals that give us green lawns and perfect gardens needs to be over, because it's hurting our children, it's hurting wildlife. But most of all, it's just sort of hurting all of us all the time. So the jury has come in on a lot of these chemicals and how deadly they are, from everything from our babies' brain development to our pets. So if you can avoid it at any cost. Avoid them, and look for organic fertilizers. Look for um, fertilizers that and other products that are going to kind of get you where you want to go in terms of that beautiful garden. I happen to be a gardener, so I'm constantly standing there thinking, oh my God, I know this thing is going to give me bigger tomatoes, but I just force myself not to buy it. So there are lots of alternatives that have turned out to be really great, whether it's a vegetable garden or a green lawn. And I really advise people to stay away from any kind of chemicals on your lawn. And nothing's more maddening if you want a green lawn than the bunch of weeds that I've got right now sprouting up all over the place. So I haven't quite figured out what I'm going to do, get my kids to go weed, but I don't think that's going to happen. But I do think it is a problem that's real, and people like green lawns and they like to have their houses look nice, but the long-term impacts on our neurological development and on animals and our water, long-term viability of our communities is all at risk. Remember, we've only been doing this for 50 years. I mean, it's not as if people have been using chemical fertilizers in the 30s and 40s. I mean, this all started at the end of World War II, and increasingly the amount of the number of chemicals and variety that have been created has just grown exponentially. But we got along and had beautiful green lawns and golf courses and everything else before these chemicals came along. They just made it incredibly easy to get that effect. So we've lived without it before. It's not very old, and with the right sort of education and understanding what's available out there, we could get rid of it altogether. And as you know, a lot of the chemicals in Roundup and everything else are under incredible attack. So it's not just chemicals for your lawn, but it's also pesticides. We had a problem with termites, and I live in a wooden house, and what were we going to do? They were eating the entire back of our house. We had to be incredibly selective about how we got rid of them. But the last thing I wanted were for my kids to be running around anywhere near these chemicals. So it was a long and hard choice, and had to rebuild the back of my house. But eventually they went away, which I was grateful, and I didn't use heavy duty chemicals.
So finding a solution. I want to jump back to protecting our forests, because you were saying that we should be supporting companies that protect the forests. Which companies would those be?
Well, again, I'm without naming names, which I wouldn't be able to do anyway. Some companies are committed to staying away from old growth forests, even though they have maybe cutting rights on some major forests. We've been able to convince them to stay away. Others are ruthlessly denuding the planet, and they give us our toilet paper and our books and everything else. But there are ways to do it, and there are companies that are doing it, really great timber companies and others that say Rainforest Alliance and some other groups that really focus on certifying timber. It's not something that Earth Day does, but there are groups that certify timber projects and companies that are doing the right thing. So they're out there. The problem is you can't, if you're a consumer, dig that deep. There's no rating or ranking when you go to buy toilet paper if this is an old growth forest or if this is not, at least in most stores. Now, some you can find that are recycled or from certified forests. You just have to literally dig a little deeper. And you can do that with toilet paper or paper towels, but try doing it for paper for other things that you need. But increasingly, I'm seeing companies that are being certified by really solid environmental organizations. And I now have easy access to paper for my printer that's recycled. So you have a combination of forest certification for paper, and you also have recycled paper, and either of those are good enough for me.
Okay. Let's talk about how to mobilize to green the grid. On a nationwide basis in 2019, it was still 62% fossil fuels. And yet you have California, which is almost half renewables now. In my hometown, Santa Monica, California, is 100% renewables. So to me, this shows what people can do when they decide they want to do it. So how do you think we can best mobilize people in states like Florida, let's say, that's over 80% fossil fuels, or Colorado that's over 74% fossil fuels, in other areas, even, even California can do better on an aggregate basis. So what are you suggesting, right to the politicians, or what do you think is the best way to put pressure on greening the grid?
Well, so it's very complicated from a consumer point of view. Some of us in the US are offered uh, either through our electric bill or through a separate mailing. I just got one yesterday that asked me to switch. I have to look at it. I haven't even opened it yesterday. I mean, just got it yesterday, and asking me to switch to renewables. Now, it doesn't mean that what's coming into my house is renewable energy, even though I would buy renewable energy. So Maryland gets most of its, which is where I live, or my part of Maryland gets most of its um, energy from Pennsylvania, which is coal. And so if I buy green energy for my house, just so you know, it doesn't mean that suddenly the power coming into my house is green. It just means that I'm buying it for somebody else. So I've committed to make my energy dollars, which I'm consuming, green by working with companies to buy energy, which would actually be built and operated and used by other people around the country. So it's not a literal switch off so that I have green energy coming into my house. The only way you can do that is either you live in a place that is powered by solar, wind, biomass, whatever you call renewable. Um, but that's really hard to find. There are communities all over the country that require you to put solar hot water or solar on your building. UC Davis, both the university and the town have remarkable green energy requirements that seem to work really well. Now they get a lot of sun, but it doesn't mean they don't have backup. And I think we have to rethink the whole system. I mean, for goodness sakes, what happened in Texas to all those people? And I have a lot of friends that live there.
Yeah.
Not just that they lost energy and people died. I mean, children actually died there. It was so insanely irresponsible of the state to let that happen. But in addition, I have a couple of friends whose energy did stay on, and they're looking at thousands. This crazy system of if you get energy during a crisis, you have to pay more. Well, they're looking at bills that are $4,000 or $5,000 for 2 weeks worth of energy. It's this weird system of you pay premium prices when energy is low. And then, of course, the governor argued that it was renewable energies that screwed everything up, which could not have been further from the truth.
Right.
And everybody was grasping at straws. So what do you do? We have a national grid, and we need to focus on that national grid. We need to end subsidies for fossil fuels completely. They do not need it. And it's a windfall for them. They have tax incentives coming out their ears. And if we want to go green, and it seems to me it's not a no-brainer, why burn something that's filthy, dirty, that makes us sick? That when you take it out of the ground, it leaves a giant permanent hole. And I've worked on this issue forever, seeing the impacts of building coal-fired power plants or coal mining or whatever. And so the long and short of it is, it's time to switch off. I think you're going to see the Biden administration coming up with some great new ideas. And so I'm looking forward to the next couple of years to see some real innovation, not just in where we get our energy, but how the national grid is restructured so we don't have to have one grid that helps us all, because energy can be decentralized. As you know, when you push energy across a line, you're losing huge parts of it. It's just falling off. That's just the way energy is just not able to be. It's very kinetic. Yeah. So we're really looking forward to seeing the innovation and people who are going to stand to make a lot of money. I'd like to be one of those people personally, but I'm an environmentalist and not heavily invested in infrastructure, but people will make lots of money. And I have seen so many kids now studying at junior colleges, et cetera, to get these degrees. And those kids are smart. They know where the action is. And the rest of the kids, including mine, who better get it together, need to look at the jobs of the future and figure out what interests them, how they can make enough money to make themselves happy and raise a family. and also participate in this great new economy, because it's just like the end of the 1800s, where it must have been an extraordinary time when things were being developed left and right, crazy. Hundreds of thousands of inventions out of people's garages. They weren't out of big tech companies. That's the other thing is I don't want 5 companies to own the green economy like we have in the tech industry. We have about 5 or 6 companies that own the whole thing.
Right.
It's obvious. And they're gigantic, and they control our information, and they are enormous. And they're my friends, by the way, who work there. So it's not as if they're bad people. It's not really the issue. It's that we can't let this happen again to the green economy. We can't have the Googles and the Apples and the Facebooks move into the green economy and a handful of other companies and own it all, because that's not how energy works. And it wouldn't be fair to the US from a competition point of view, nor to the rest of the world, to mimic what we have or replicate what we have in the tech industry. So I'm hoping that by opening up the green economy and getting lots and lots of kids engaged, that we can solve the energy issues from the community all the way up to the national and then global.
All right. Well, I've taken up a lot of your time, but I want to leave you with the opportunity to just do a call to action on the great global cleanup, or anything else you wanted to say about the events that are happening both right before Earth Day and again on April 22nd.
Yeah, I mean, we learned the hard way. We planned this massive Earth Day 2020 for our 50th anniversary, and we expected 1 billion people to be participating in Earth Day on the ground, cleanups, tree planting, enormous wide range of things, big events, town halls. We had thousands and thousands of mayors that were going to gather their people, and it all fell apart. And what we learned is that we can still get a lot of work done by joining together, like we're joined together right now in a conversation about how to solve the crisis. Now, Earth Day comes at this particular time, and if you listen to President Biden, Earth Day will just be at the mark where the administration saying life will start to go back to normal. And our cleanups, our tree planting, our on-the-ground activities, our community gardens, our projects, it's like we have so much pent-up energy. We're seeing everybody, right, left, center, all over the world, this incredible anxiety and desire to get the heck out of their house and get into the community and do something. It's a period of, I think, enlightenment, both from a tech and thought process and thought leader process. But we're also sick of the walls. Now I'm looking at you and you look like you're sitting in front of a garden. It makes me want to step out there with you, but I have a feeling you're in your house. So but you're in California, which is painfully sunny. And so I'm still looking out my window at piles of snow, but nonetheless, people are excited. They are excited to get out and do something. And the great global cleanup, we're having people sign up left, right, all over the place. They're so excited to get out there and clean up the world that has been overrun with plastic, and in some places overrun with PPE and some other stuff. So we're seeing a lot of energy, and I think it's a time of renewal. Spring is that way anyway, but keep in mind, in the Southern Hemisphere, they're going into winter, and they're just as enthusiastic down there as we are up here, where they're going into winter and we're going into summer. So I think we'll have a huge turnout this year. And if nothing else, 2022 will be the biggest Earth Day we've ever had.
Well, that's a good place to start. And visit earthday.org. And there's just a million resources for you to get started on, and at least 51 action plans that we can take as individuals. So thank you, Kathleen, for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And we'll be seeing you soon.
Okay. Thanks. Bye.